Hi, so for this case question, we're going to go through a more product business style question asked by Netflix. So the question is, let's say you work at Netflix as a data scientist on their pricing team. Netflix is a subscription business, and so they charge a monthly price for the consumer to pay. Given this price, they've decided, how you determine if the price of the Netflix subscription is actually the deciding factor for a consumer to buy?
Okay, great. Thank you for the question. We'll talk a little bit about the problem like approach, how to structure this problem. So the very first thing you guys probably hear a lot about is asking clarifying questions.
Mhm.
So in this case, because you're asking for a Netflix subscription service, so a few relevant clarifying questions I can think of is we talk about subscription, right? But right now, if I'm correct, Netflix currently have three subscription tiers: the
Mhm.
basic, standard, and the premium. So as an interviewer, would you like me to focus on one specific tier or for all three tiers, for example?
Let's focus on all three tiers.
All
Yeah.
three tiers. Okay, sounds good.
Let's
And
start with
then,
one and then focus and then jump to
yeah,
the
I
other one.
think, yeah, we can start with one and then maybe we can maybe talk about standard package and we can elaborate time permits
Okay.
to the other tiers as well. And then my second question is, I'm aware that Netflix is currently available across different countries in the world, but because
Mhm.
of a copyright and stuff, there is a geographic difference in terms of what content users are seeing, right? For example, Korea, they might be seeing like more Korea copyright content, which will be different from US. So
Yep.
for the purpose of this question, is it okay I just, let's say, focus on the US?
Yeah, let's
As
say
my
US only.
okay, US only. Okay, so let's talk about standard package and US only. Let's just take a little pause. The reason why clarifying is really important is because it
Hmm.
helps you simplify the question, right? Because what Jay had asked was really vague and broad. You always want to answer an easier question than a more complex question. So this will help you narrow the problem down. So
Yep.
definitely ask good and relevant clarifying questions. And then the very next thing I would do is specify like the goal or getting more context around this question. So for Jay, I understand you want to know whether price is the deciding factor. Could you also talk about more around like what's the motivation behind it? Is Netflix thinking about changing prices in the near future? Maybe we're seeing a lot of competition during COVID, like we're worried about other factors.
So I think two aspects. Let's say that we want to know if we can, let's say, increase prices and not lose customers, whatever that means. And then also we're seeing growing competition from other services such as Disney Plus, Hulu, Apple TV, etc.
Yeah. So this question, basically, I'm trying to get a sense of goal from Jay, but also at the same time, like getting more context around why we're solving this problem. What's the ultimate goal, right? We're trying to reach. So going back to the goal again, I think you talk a little about the competition and price. So in terms of the goal, is Netflix goal ultimately to like gain more market share? Or is the ultimate goal just to maybe increase the total revenue? Or is it around like maybe around engagements?
Gotcha. So I think as an interviewer, I'd be just curious to think what you
Yeah,
thought would be like the best goal between those two
yeah.
because they are
Awesome.
good.
Yeah, also thank you for throwing the ball back to me because usually as an interviewer, that's they want to see your thought
Yeah.
process. As I what I did is I offer like three options like revenue, market share, and then engagement. As an interviewee, I think I can provide one solution. And then the strategy to do that is you can pick a solution you're like comfortable with. Like you've done a lot about maybe like revenue modeling in the past. So on the technical perspective, strategically pick the topic you think you're more likely to excel at, but
Yeah.
also give a reasonable response.
Yeah,
So,
that's a good point.
so yeah, so you don't want to pick, okay, like, let's go with, let's say revenue, because I think it's important. That to the interviewer, it's not a very good
Yeah.
reasoning. Like you need to have evidence of some sort of why you pick one over the other.
Hmm.
So for example, in this case, maybe since you talk about competition and all that, I know previously Netflix has never sort of reduced their price in the past.
Yep.
So we're thinking about increasing the price, but we're also worried about like the competitions and like maybe losing subscribers. So
Hmm.
maybe I think ultimately revenue is the top line because revenue ultimately decides on the profit margin of how much Netflix is making. If let's say we're seeing a lot of competitions, but we want to let's say, increase our catalog of the type of shows we're offering. That means more cost to Netflix. That also means we need to increase the price in order to cope that difference. So that part I've explained, maybe it's a little bit on the longer side, but just maybe give a one-liner on why revenue is important in this case and why you pick that one over the other.
No, that's a good example. Yeah. I like that.
So after you've clarified the goal, the next thing you want to go into is talk about your structure and approach. So very important tip for all these interviews is having a logical way of explaining your answer. So what I would do is I would maybe take a few seconds, just say straight up, like, Jay, is it okay for me to take a few minutes or take a few seconds writing down my thought process before I proceed? So usually the interviewer is completely okay with it. Let's talk about how I would approach this problem. So basically, we want to reiterate the question again. We care about whether price is a determination factor, right? So there are a couple of ways we can go about. There are three approaches I like to take. The first of all is to do some sort of retrospective analysis, looking at historical data, and then have an indication the relationship between price and then maybe the subscription rate or renew rate or the churn rate or one over the other. And then the second is I want to think about maybe doing some type of user surveys to get a direct response of when a user decide to churn the service, like out of the top 5 answers, which one did they pick the most? So that would be like a more causal type of relationship. And then finally, we can also think about some kind of A/B experiment. Now, the A/B experiment might be tricky in a Netflix case, just because offering different users a different price might be disturbing, especially in the same country, right? We talk about US only, but there might be some trick we can do. For example, maybe offer like a 1 month free, right? That could be an indication of whether they are price sensitive or not. Or we can do some kind of country test, like finding a country that's similar to the US, maybe Canada, right? Provided the fact they offer similar content. So we have to think about all these confounding factors. So these are basically like 3 areas I like to explore. And then the next I will talk about like how do I run this analysis. So in terms of how to run analysis, I talk about like data first, and then I talk about model, and finally we talk about like how to validate. So around the data, basically I think as an interviewee, you can talk about like how do you collect the data, what type of data would you collect, and then over a how long period of time, right? So for the first retrospective analysis, we already addressed is like we want to look at historical data. So Netflix have definitely increased their price in the past. I actually have most recently, I just read about like in October, they just increased their price for the standard and premium package for $1 or $2 respectively. So I think a plus here for all the interviewees out there, like that's why doing the previous research is so important on the team you'll be interviewing for. So if you can mention like some of these news that you read in the articles or like you've read in the media blogs and all that, that's definitely a huge plus because it just provided you like you are interested in this field. And then my second tip is like also use the product. Netflix, you might have to pay, or I don't know if they still have the trial going on right now, but pretty much all the tech software products is free. So definitely download it and try it out because sometimes you might even run into problems, right? Like maybe there are a particular area that they can possibly fix. And by not using the product, you wouldn't figure out that part. And then that could be a plus if you bring up to the interview, you telling me a solution I haven't even thought about. So that's another tip here. So after I talked about the 3, I think I talked about the observational study and then talk about how you would collect the data and then how you would compare the models. So going back to the price again, another tip is you laid out a structure, you have 3 problem areas, and then you go back to the first one, and then we might derail like your interviewer depending on their interests. Like for example, Jay might be particularly interested in retrospective, right? So try to be also time conscious of what you spend in each area. If you talk about all 3, you might want to cover all 3. And if you talk about like validation and also maybe trade-offs between all these 3 approaches, sometimes as a team, we might not have the time and effort to run all these 3 analyses, right? Maybe this first one is what I should do. So try to be time conscious on how you spend on each, because if you don't end up having the time to cover all of them, then it might be a problem of not hitting the points what the interviewer is looking for. But be flexible too, because the interviewer might have a very strong preference over one area over the other, then they're okay for you to spend more time. So for example, I already spent a lot of time talking about observation in this case, Jay. Then I could prompt back to the interviewer. I think survey and also A/B tests are also really important. Do you have a preference of me talking one over the other? Because time permits. I also want to get into the validation part.
So I would say that I care less about the survey and more about the actual analyses that can be done given the existing data.
Given the existing data. Okay, so you want me to talk a little bit more on how to collect the historical data and how to analyze existing data?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so a really great tip, even though you offer 3 analysis, but then by asking Jay, like what you should narrow down, you just have to focus on one and then make that case really, really good. So going back to the analysis, like the data we should collect. From here, I think there are 3 sort of dimensions of data we should collect. Obviously, price is one of them, right? We talk about increasing price in the past, but then maybe the interviewer also care about like, if price is not the most important, like what other factors could play a really important factor? Maybe let's say the user didn't watch the show over the last 28 days, they're more likely to churn. Or like maybe they're very interested in a particular topic of show. Like let's say I'm interested in competitions, right? Whatever, baking competitions, whatnot, but Netflix stopped offering the Great British Baking Show was the only show. And then the season ended, they stopped offering other baking related shows. Then I also lose interest. So to summarize, I think I would look for like 3 key metric areas. So one is like around consumption metric, like time span and all that I talked about. And then 2 around interaction, right? Like did people ever like or rate a video? Did they share with their friends? And also around the time metric is around tenure, right? How long they have been on the platform. What's their life cycle? And finally, we can also think about demographic or what I call attitudinal. So maybe this person is live in a certain zip code. There's some socioeconomical situation. Maybe like they're more price sensitive to a price increase, depends on the physical address of where they live. So those are demographic data you can collect. So after I talk about like collecting all these features, make sure you try to categorize them. Oftentimes some candidates just talk about some like random ideas here and there, like, oh, I think about this feature, oh, I think about some other feature, but like there's no logical connection of how you thought about these 3 features. So the interviewer can get lost. So try to categorize them. Sometimes it can be hard. So your very initial like 2-3 minutes you took to jot down your thoughts are really important because that helps you to categorize them. And that makes it really clear to the interviewer what you're looking for. So let me take a pause here. I know we talk about data collection and all that. Next time I want to talk about modeling and talk about what type of model or retrospective analysis we should do in order to get some sort of indication of whether price is important.
Before you take a pause, I guess ask, do you think taking multiple pauses throughout is better than taking one big one in the beginning? Or like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the preference. Like personally speaking, I'm okay with them taking a longer pause in the initial, and then I prefer like the rest of the interview just kind of like as a conversation back and forth.
Okay.
Although I've seen candidates like stuck during the interview and needing the time to take a pause. I think it's okay as long as you're not taking too many of them. Like let's say, okay, I need another minute to write down my thoughts. Like if you do more than 2 or like more than 3, I think 3 would probably be the max. Like that would be probably too much. I would say try to take as much of the time you can in the beginning, because the interviewer also wanted to be engaged, right? Like if you take pauses in between the interview, like they might get bored, like the flow kind of got broken, right? In between. So like I think the flow is also really important. So some people might not mind. For me personally, I'm okay with them taking long pause initially, because I also want you to talk out loud. Sometimes like that awkward silence can be a problem if it's too often.
Yes, definitely.
Modeling, I won't talk too much detail on the technicals. I think as the interviewee, you can give a couple of options. So to me, it's a pretty like obvious churn model or renew model we're thinking about. So think about like binary, like what your response variable should be, right? What's your Y, which you're trying to optimize for, like churn 0 and 1, and what your axis should be. So we talk a lot about these features already. So have some model in the back of your mind. For this case, it could be like survivors analysis, some type of like deep learning regression. So have these model options in the back of your mind and talk through like why would be relevant in this case. So I won't go into too much detail on the technicals for this part.
Okay.
And then finally, I think after doing all these analysis, we'll probably do some kind of ranking, right? So price being one of the factors, but there are maybe 100 other factors that are talked about or features talked about, and then maybe we can rank them based on our model result. And then price it could turns out to be like the top one, or it could turns out to maybe the top 3. So based on the analysis result, I can give you an answer of whether price is the determination factor or not.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So that's pretty much as far as what the structure goes. I think for the most of the interview, it depends on the time, right? Depends on how much you said, explaining all these model and stuff. You might have extra time. In this case, we have maybe like 10 more minutes to talk about other considerations. So I think an important tip here is what I'm looking for as an interviewer is also whether the candidate is being creative. So creativity is very, very important. All these things I talked about, maybe it's sort of standard. Like if I've done a lot of interviews, like all these candidates can think about feature collection model and all that. But then I'm always looking for that moonshot idea. So being creative, I think it can be hard to teach.
Yes.
I think it really comes down to your experience. And then when I say experience, it's about like readings and research you've done in the past. Because coming up with something brand new on the spot, like you're already really nervous during interview, right? Can be really hard. Like you probably just want to finish the interview with no hiccups. Like that's your goal. But then if you can do some research and readings ahead of time, have some ideas in the back of your pocket, that will really help. So for the Netflix case, I would do, beside the research I talked about, is another tip is like you can think about what problems Netflix could be facing. So for example, we talk about competition, like that's already addressed. But the other one is I've read about like family sharing could be a potential problem. Because as you're aware, right, like Netflix allow up to 4 accounts depending on the tier, but the maximum is 6. But then a lot of the millennials and these days are sometimes like 10 or like 20 or 50. I don't know the extreme case. It can be sharing one account, which is actually violating the Netflix sort of policy. So you can, if you read about certain, like you can talk about like how Netflix is trying to address this problem. Obviously it has to relate it to the pricing or whatever, like the topic you guys are addressing, like not talk about like some random idea that's unrelated just because you want to say that idea. That's also no good. Try to be relevant to the question you're trying to address. That's why I feel like you need to have a couple of ideas in place. And then another idea I thought about is when we talk about pricing, right? We talk about like price elasticity. Like if you increase price, obviously there will be less subscription, but the total revenue might increase, like vice versa.
Yep.
So one idea is about like the maturity of the market Netflix is in. Since we're focusing on US, one of my assumptions is like Netflix right now have a pretty sort of saturated marketplace and the competition is really high. So instead of growing new users, we'll probably just worry about like not to lose existing users to our competitors, right? So in order to not lose new users and by increasing the price, we might think about like how much to increase depends on the price sensitivity. So for example, like maybe I'm already subscribed to the service. Like for example, like if you're subscribed to Amazon Prime, like you're not constantly looking at how much you subscribe. And then people are generally like forgetful or lazy about whether they increase $1 or $2. So for a saturated market like this, mature market like this, price increase is probably less affecting the churn rate than in a brand new market, right? For example, you're tapping into a new market. I don't know, like China probably doesn't have Netflix. Maybe one day we can tap into China, for example. Then people are extremely price sensitive, right? Of how much you're offering. So like this mature versus less mature market could be a consideration. So you can bring it up, even though you picked US, but you can still say, okay, if we were to do a complete different geographic region, my analysis could be completely different. So have these like good innovative ideas in the back of your pockets are really helpful. And then any thoughts from your end before?
No, I like that idea. And I think having it be more real world also helps. Like you can bring in those facts about that you know that it's like pretty saturated right now. You're not
Yeah.
just like spewing these like ideas of churn and retention based on like historical stuff, and it's actually like related to stuff that's happening right now. So it's just like actually applying it as like a real business scenario where you're
Yeah.
to like someone in which you might be the decision holder for like the actual company versus just like a theoretical kind of scenario where it's you don't know too much about the background or the information,
Yeah.
like the context of what's happening around it.
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah, totally agree with you, Jay, on this one. Like, just imagine you're already an analyst or data scientist on the Netflix team, right? Pricing team, right? Let's say
Yeah.
your manager come to you with this question, like, how would you answer it? How would you collect the data? I think that really puts you at ease. Like, you're really like immersing yourself into the business and trying to solve this problem together with the interviewer rather than just like trying to answer this interview question.
Yeah.
I think that's the best approach. Like, it will also make you more comfortable. So having this mindset, I think for all the candidates, I think like super, super important. And then I wanted to share like 2 other tips that just throughout this interview, like 2 other taboos or tips that can help with the interview. The first is around be prepared to expand on any topic you mentioned.
Yeah.
So whether that's like a particular terminology mentioned or like whether that's like a particular point you mentioned. For example, I talk about price elasticity earlier, right? Maybe you talk about like collaborative filtering, like if we talk about recommended system in Netflix, then those are slightly more complex terms. And sometimes if the interviewer is familiar with the subject, they will actually grill you on it or they will ask a deeper question. So be prepared to answer these questions. If you're actually not familiar with this topic or this term, it's better not to mention it. Then like mention something. I've often see candidates like mention a term that they're not 100% familiar with. And then once I ask a deeper question, I just feel like they just completely zone out, like not be able to answer it. So like that's a really, really big taboo. Make sure it's same thing as anything you put on your resume. You should have the evidence to back them up. Like that's the same thing. So make sure you are ready of everything you say, and how well you answer the follow-up question to me is actually more important than like how well your initial thought process is, because you're directly addressing what's pressing on the interviewer's mind.
Okay.
So that's one other tip. And then I guess my final tip is you also want to draw your current expertise into the equation. What I mean by that is, for example, I mentioned earlier, the team I'm currently with is Stadia at Google. We also have a subscription model. It's slightly different from the Netflix subscription model because we also have a free tier, meaning that like people can sign up for free and then purchase the games on a one-off basis. If you can possibly draw from your current existing experience to provide some ideas to the subscription that Netflix has, like that's a big plus. So for example, since we talk about survey, right? Maybe Netflix right now, I'm sure they're running surveys, but maybe like Netflix right now is thinking about improving their survey response or improving how they design their survey. Maybe only like 1% people fill out the survey when they churn, or like the survey pop up, there's some problem with it. So I can offer some advice on how we design the survey at Stadia, or like when we pick the multiple choice, right? Maybe the ranking of the choice matter. Like if, let's say we have other, like usually people were just lazy, right? They just pick other. Like what's the reason you unsubscribe? Blah, 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 right? Price, maybe not enough content. I don't care about 4K, whatever. And then you have other, and then people just like oftentimes just like pick other, just they want to skip to like close this window quickly. So like that's our techniques we can learn to like or provide value to Netflix. I'm sure Netflix already thought about, but it's good to bring it up and like draw from your existing experience and how you guys addressed it in your current team. So this not only shows like if I were to hire you, Jay, or someone else, right? Like I feel like you're bringing extra value to my team, provided you already worked on this problem in the past. You already work on this problem in the past, and then you're bringing these innovative ideas, drawing from your existing experience. So usually interviewer would prefer someone, if you're direct hire, not a generic hire, probably doesn't matter. If a direct hire, they prefer someone has the experience over someone has no experience, right? Also, the domain expertise also matters. So that's a little tip. You might not get lucky in this case. I talk about subscription, right? But think about other areas you can draw the dots, connect the dots, and then try to bring what you're working on your current team as a add-on value to this team you're interviewing for.
Awesome. No, that's great. And that's super helpful in general. And I've heard of adding your own expertise and experience is very, very helpful because you're showcasing that you have that knowledge and that you've thought about it very deeply before, right?
Yeah. And sometimes the interviewer might not like ask you for it, like specifically. So try to take the initiative and mention it when it comes to the right spot. And also don't make it too rigid. I talk this about like rigid framework a lot. Like sometimes people feel like they have to talk, they prepare this and they have to talk about it. So they just slot that idea in very like awkwardly in certain spot. Like that just make the interviewer feel like you want to say for the sake of saying it. So finding the right spot to say it, I think that's also comes with experience and practice as well. That's something to be aware of.
Awesome. Thanks, Ying. And I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Jay. Take care.